Hello, and welcome to week 3, which is our online class for advanced ABA Psych 520. Today we're going to talk about indirect behavioral assessments, also referred in some of your readings and some of this PowerPoint as indirect functional assessment. So indirect functional assessments or behavioral assessments are structured interviews, checklists, rating scales, or questionnaires used to obtain information from people who are familiar with the individual exhibiting the behavior problem. Indirect behavioral assessments are used to identify conditions or events in the natural environment that correlate with problem behavior. So in week 1, I showed you a structured interview that I used that included a checklist. Today we're going to talk about, and your readings are, a much more comprehensive structured interview by O'Neill and a rating scale, the most popular rating scale, and that is the MASS. And we'll talk more about both of those. So let's start off with the functional assessment interview by O'Neill. And this is one of the most popular and comprehensive structured interviews. It includes, as you'll find in your readings, a whole host of things. Some of the highlights are, of course, a description of the target behaviors or behaviors of concern. O'Neill also spends time talking about this next two categories, which are basically, think about those as being primarily antecedent conditions. Now, if we wanted to, we could have discussions about the ecological events. It sounds like mostly those would come under what Cooper would call a motivating operation that you guys, I'm sure, read about last semester with Jane. Those are things like sleep. So obviously the amount of sleep a person gets could affect their behavior, and it's an antecedent condition, probably a motivating operation, because it might affect the potency of a reinforcer, like being able to avoid something you don't want to do. That the reinforcement for avoiding something like that might be enhanced if you're also sleep deprived, or at least it is for me. Then there's predictive event situations, which again are other kinds of antecedent conditions. Some of these you might consider setting events, so they might be physical aspects of the environment like crowding or noise level, but might be very immediate antecedent events like the presence or absence of demand situations, presence or absence of preferred individuals, the materials that are present, the time of the day, all of those kinds of antecedent conditions. Then, of course, O'Neill also talks about identifying the functions of the behaviors, which we talked about in week 1. So is it appear to be maintained by some aspect of positive reinforcement, attention, tangibles, negative reinforcement, or automatically maintained. Also talks about functional alternatives or replacement behaviors, which are great when you're coming up with a treatment. That is, and we'll spend a lot more time talking about those when we talk about the treatment part of this course, but what are some of those behaviors that a person can learn or we can reinforce that would allow them to get the same reinforcer that they're getting by engaging in the target behavior. So, an obvious example might be if a person becomes physically aggressive to escape or avoid an unpleasant situation, can we teach them a more socially appropriate way of getting out of doing something that they don't want to do, like asking for a break? O'Neill's Functional assessment interview also includes what's the communication mode the person is using, and identifying preferred stimuli, which we talked about last week, which is an important part of any comprehensive functional assessment that we do. And then finally, a history of what has worked and what hasn't worked, which I find really is very valuable in terms of coming up with an effective treatment and understanding the behavior better. So O'Neill's functional assessment interview suggests many relationships that a less inclusive kind of assessment might miss, and I think that's important. I've had several examples. I can think of one that was fairly recent of a fellow that I worked with who engaged in rumination. As many of you know, that's bringing up digested food and swallowing it again and bringing it up. And not only is it a behavior that makes it difficult for staff to work with an individual, but more importantly, it's also can present a significant medical risk, as it was doing for this person, because you're getting those acids from your stomach are going up and down your esophagus, and it can do long-term damage. So essentially, we tried several treatments to address the rumination, and it seemed like the behavior, the rumination, just went away. 2 times that we tried it. So we started looking at it more closely and did a more intense functional assessment, more like O'Neill's, and realized that there seemed to be a pattern of time that it occurred during certain time of the year, and it ended at a certain time of the year, sort of independent of what we did. So then we looked into that more closely. It turned out that it was related to allergies. He took an allergy medication, and the rumination went away. So it was a very simple solution that if we would have done a more comprehensive functional assessment like O'Neill's, we would have saved ourselves a lot of time and saved him a lot of medical problems with rumination. So I do think that there are times that you really need to think about having a very comprehensive functional assessment interview. That's why I like people to at least look at and have access to O'Neill's functional assessment interview. By the way, I will remind me, but next time we have class together, I'll bring O'Neill's book in. This is a book that has the functional assessment interview, obviously, that you're reading about this week. Next week, you'll read about his variation of a direct descriptive assessment, his variation of an ABC assessment, which again is much more comprehensive than the typical ones that we use. And it's a paperback book, and it has all these preference assessments. It has all these assessments in it that are on perforated pages. You can just rip them out. It's made to rip them out, make copies of them, and use them or modify them and add them to your arsenal of functional assessment tools. So it might be a book that is worthwhile for you guys to look at and potentially purchase down the road if you feel like you're having trouble coming up with these functional assessment tools. All right, the another kind of indirect behavioral assessment or functional assessment is a rating scale. And one of the most popular indirect assessment rating scales is Duran and Crimmins Motivation Assessment Scale, which is also known as the MASS. You're going to read a Duran and Crimmins article where they introduce the MASS, and they suggest that the MASS is an alternative to doing a full functional analysis. Now, we will start talking about functional analyses in the next couple of weeks, but I think you all have a pretty good idea. And in the introduction, I did talk about those. That's an actual experiment. What Duran and Crimmins are suggesting is that their mass can be a substitute for doing a full functional analysis. So in this study that you're going to read, they conducted a research with 50 individuals with self-injurious behavior, and they concluded that the results of the mass were reliable across raters. That's key. And that the mass predicted individuals' function of SIB. So they didn't include a copy of the mass, so I included a copy of it in your readings. But it's a 16-item rating scale, so it doesn't take long to do. Raters, individuals who know the individual engaging in the target behaviors, rate each of the items on a 7-point Likert type scale from, oh yes, this always happens, to, oh no, it never happens, kind of thing. And they attempt to isolate those functions that we talked about, or I talked about, in the first week online course. So social positive attention, social positive tangibles, social negative reinforcement, escape or avoiding, and then finally sensory or automatic. I tried to get the whole scale on this slide, but you couldn't see it through the YouTube magic. So this is just a truncated version, but as I said, I did include a full mass for those of you who haven't used it or seen it, although I suspect most of you have in your readings. But you can see the questions get at, they're pretty straightforward here. Does this behavior ever occur whenever you stop attending to him or her? So obviously if you rank that one as always or almost always, that would suggest that there's an attention component. Does it appear to you that he or she enjoys performing this behavior and would continue even if no one was around? So that's getting at obviously an automatic kind of condition. Then you just score them all up and voila, you get your score. Now, despite its widespread use, there have been a number of studies that failed to replicate the high reliability of the mass that among raters that Duran and Crimmins indicated in their study. Now, obviously, that's important because it calls into question its practical use if different raters are going to give you absolutely different kinds of scores. So if there isn't a high degree of reliability among raters, then the mass is generally not going to be very effective. So Zarconi et al., the third article that you're reading this week, attempted to replicate Duran and Crimmins with another large sample. They used the same correlation methods as Duran and Crimmins, plus a more stringent item-by-item correlation, and their conclusion was that there really was not very high inter-rater reliability. So obviously it's important to determine whether it is reliable. Again, if it doesn't have high inter-rater reliability, then it's not going to be very useful as a functional assessment tool. All right, so this week, read the O'Neill chapter on the functional assessment interview. Actually, you're going to read half of that chapter this week, pages 9 to 35, and then pages 35 to 54 you'll read next week when we talk about descriptive assessments. Read the Duran and Crimmins article, and by the way, I need to apologize. I made copies of both of those, and they're in your readings. Two things about that is, One, I realized that the ones that I have are all marked up, that I marked up when I read them. So if you'd prefer not to see those, you can get clean copies in the library. Two is, I also realized that the machine stuck 2 pages together, and I just realized that just before I did this PowerPoint. So I went back and added those. There's 1 page from O'Neill's chapter and 1 page from Duran and Crimmins' article that didn't get copied, so there's a second copy that includes that page. So that's a little inconvenient. I'm sorry about that. And then read the Zarconi article. Actually, I think it's the Zarconi and O'Neill. I can't remember, but 2 of those, there's an extra page that didn't get copied, and I made a separate copy of it. All right, so in addition to reading those articles, also, I assume that most of you, or at least some of you, have had some personal experience with the mass, or you've done a functional assessment or worked with an individual who had a mass, and you read the results of the mass, and so we're able to evaluate how useful you thought it was. But even if you haven't, the assignment for this week is this. If you have experience with the mass, based on that experience and this week's readings, if you don't have experience with the mass, then just based on this week's readings, is tell me, you're going to have to do, or maybe you do them already, functional assessments. Everybody, with every individual, should do an indirect functional assessment. That is, at least interviewing individuals that caregivers that are familiar with the individual engaging in the target behaviors. So how would you conduct an indirect functional assessment given what the readings are you read this week and your own experiences with the mass? So bring that assignment with you to our next face-to-face class, which will be Thursday, February 19th. All right, so next week is a face-to-face class, Thursday the 19th. So for that class, you're going to read, before that class, we're going to start talking about direct functional assessments. And remember, the definitions are sometimes tricky because different people use different terminology, and different articles are going to use different terminology. So a direct functional assessment, recall from week 1, is when you, as the BCBA, are doing an observation. That could be either descriptive, that is, you're just observing what's happening, or it could be a functional analysis, or an experiment, essentially, where you're manipulating the environment. So next week, we are going, in our face-to-face class, we're going to talk about the descriptive direct functional assessments. Now, I only asked you to read 2 articles, that is, the second half of the O'Neill chapter on direct observations, and the Lerman and Iwata article, where they actually compare direct functional assessments that are descriptive with a direct functional assessment that's an experiment that's a functional analysis. Now, I only asked you to read 2, and it's mostly because that Lerman and Iwata article can be very thick. I don't mean thick in terms of number of pages, although it's that too, but it can be difficult to read. It's Dorothy Lerman's master's thesis, and she was very thorough. I will cover that article in class, but I really want you to try. Don't give up on it, because I think there's a lot of important things, particularly in the introduction when they start to articulate, because a lot of the language that they're using around functional assessments in the introduction to that chat to that article are the basis of how we do functional assessments today. So take your time, read those 2 articles, and bring in the assignment from the previous week around how you would do an indirect functional assessment, along with a rationale as to why you would conduct it in a particular way. All right. If you have any other questions, email me or write something in the discussion forum and I'll respond. Otherwise, I will see you on Thursday, February 19th. Have a good week.